Hello, good morning. So I've been sitting here for 3 talks. If you guys want to stand up, stretch your legs, it's not going to offend me. If you want to interrupt me, yeah, go ahead. Seize the opportunity. And if you want to interrupt me and ask a question, you're welcome to. Before I get started, I want to say that I don't have the answer, okay? And I'm saying that because I can't see the screen, but I can watch all your faces while you're listening to people talk. And I remember being 27, 28, whatever, coming out of grad school and thinking, you know, I've done it, right? I was good in high school. I went to college. All of you guys get good grades, right? You've done everything you're supposed to do, and you're waiting for someone to say, and yay, this is what you do next, and you'll get a job. And it's not going to happen that way, all right? So I'm a professor, but I didn't get there the traditional way, and I worked in other places before I got to the professorship. So I can maybe tell you a little bit about that. And then I'm going to tell you some things about interviewing. One of my students is here, so she can vouch that sometimes I'm a grumpy guy. So I'm going to tell you my interviewing things by telling you some grumpy stories that I've run across. So this is my career outline. I did my Bachelor of Science at Miami University, did a PhD at Purdue. I grew up in Indiana. I grew up in Indianapolis, as a matter of fact, and so as a little high school kid, all the way through the time I got through Purdue, I always thought I was going to be a guy working at Eli Lilly, and that today they would have invited me here because I'm some big exec at Eli Lilly, and I had discovered some drug at Eli Lilly. I mean, that was it. That was my narrow focus. And there was no job for a natural products chemist at Eli Lilly in 1997. I ended up doing an industrial postdoc. I will tell all of you who are graduate students, you absolutely should do a postdoc. And I would also say that industrial postdoc is a mistake. Don't do an industrial postdoc. Go postdoc somewhere else. Now, I will say that my postdoc worked out in that I learned 2 things. One, I hated it. Absolutely hated it. I'm too grumpy, yeah. And it was my first step to realize that I didn't really like working in industry. And it took me until years later to finally come all the way around to academics and kind of figure it out for myself. But the other thing that it helped me get is it got me my first job at Research Triangle Institute. And the way I got that job, so for those of you who don't know, Research Triangle Institute is in the park. It was in the park before anybody else. It was the very first thing that was there. It's a private, nonprofit research institute. So especially in this area, you can say we're kind of like a university without students or a basketball team. And it's an important point that we don't have students because no one's paying the bills, all right? So it's basically a contract research organization. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it took to work at Research Triangle Institute. Why RTI is somewhat famous is because that's where Taxol was discovered. Taxol is a drug that if you're ever unfortunate enough to have breast cancer or ovarian cancer, it'll probably save your life, or at least extend it for a long period of time. So from a natural products perspective, it was a great opportunity for me to work there. I spent my over 10 years there, almost 11 years, worked all the way up to eventually directing a natural products group. Probably would still be there today, except things kind of changed in that environment, and then I moved more towards an academic environment. Some things changed and some opportunities presented themselves, and I think a lot of the speakers have said, like, seize opportunity. You should do that. You never know when someone you meet is going to eventually sort of lead you to a new job. And I hate when people say things like, you really should consider networking, all right? Chemists don't network, right? Just business guys network. But they're absolutely right. You meet people at meetings, they become your friends and your colleagues, and that sort of helps you make a connection with somebody to get to your next job. So let me tell you about life at Research Triangle Institute. Incidentally, Research Triangle Institute now calls itself RTI International. So you might hear us sometimes on NPR. They would talk about RTI International, turning knowledge into practice. Yeah. You know, the funny thing is they used to ask the people who work there, did you hear the commercial on NPR? And they would let you send in things anonymously, what you thought about it. And I always said that it made me feel like I wanted to drive into a bridge abutment every time I heard it. And the reason is, if you listen to the commercial, they're turning knowledge into practice. But they never talk about it on the chemistry side. They're always talking about things they do in economics, people they do in local governance, all kinds of things. They hardly ever mention, they never mention chemistry. Yet they discovered a compound that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Anyway, I digress. So So here was my life at RTI. I started out as a postdoc, ended up working for a guy who was about 80 years old when I got there. And the guy immediately under him was about 71. And then there was me, okay? And so, you know, they had made a big mistake. They had never groomed anybody along the way. There should have been somebody who was about 40 or 50 to take over, but there hadn't been, and there wasn't going to be. And so it was a huge opportunity for me. I went from being an industrial postdoc, I'll even tell you my salary. I was being paid $48,000 a year as an industrial postdoc in 1998, which sounds like a lot of money, except when you're living in Princeton, New Jersey. It's nothing, okay? The other cool thing was they would pay me once a week, which is totally different than grad school. Like, so you could blow the money on the weekend, boom, you'd get paid again. And then I hated it. As I said, I mean, I absolutely hated the job. And it was really eye-opening for me because I remember thinking to myself, my God, I've spent, you know, my whole life getting to this point, right? I'm on my way towards that industrial career. And I took this other postdoc position at RTI because, as our previous speaker said, I kind of knew what I loved. And I took a salary of like, I don't know, $26,000 or something like that, which I don't know, I think typical postdocs now are like $35,000. It always sounds like nothing, but I will tell you, a postdoc is a great time because you don't have to do anything, right? All you have to do is your science. Do your science and publish. You don't have to write the grants. Someone else is finding the grants for you. You don't have to teach any classes. You don't have to take any tests. It's really, you're actually your best as a scientist when you're a postdoc, right? Now, I mean, I fake that I'm pretty good to my students, but they're the ones who are really doing all the work. Don't repeat that, by the way. So, okay, so started out as a postdoc, and so I was being groomed from day one to like sort of how to, by this guy who was 80 years old, how can you eventually take over this? So he's telling me, I would spend hours in his office listening to stories about the good old days of chemistry, how to meet people. He was the guy who said to me, don't hide behind your poster at a meeting, something like that, and get involved with a scientific organization. And he's absolutely right how those things pan themselves out. I eventually worked my way up to a research associate, kind of like a leader, kind of a senior postdoc, sort of the go-to guy, helped lead things in the laboratory, and then a research chemist. And a research chemist is sort of the way you worked your way up the chain. I was a chemist 1, a chemist 2, a chemist 3 as I was going. And as you work your way up the chain, you have to sort of write a lot. And the model at Research Triangle Institute, which is a similar model at the other research institutes in the country, there are probably a half dozen of them, is go find a big grant or a big contract, something that's going to ballast the ship, right? Because there's no students. There's no teaching organic chemistry on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? There's nothing to pay the bills at all, unless you're fortunate enough to have some underlying foundation. And given the way the economy is right now with the stock market in the tank, even an underlying foundation gets turned off at times, right? So the big contract would pay the bills, and we would then try to leverage things off those contracts. So leverage new ideas. We had a contract once that asked us to isolate some compounds from a plant called milk thistle. We did it. When we got done, we realized no one else had done this in the world, ever, okay? Which is kind of rare. In natural products, usually somebody's done something around it. No one had ever isolated in the world. We then parlayed that into an R01 grant, and I've parlayed it into like 2 or 3 other projects since then. It's probably about 40% of my research. So your side projects often become the main gig, right? I was writing grants all the time. Those of you who are not going into academics, I bet you one of the reasons why you don't want to go into academics is because you say to yourself, oh, my professor's writing grants all the time. It's a woeful thing. It kind of is. I mean, it's depressing when you don't win them. I can tell you that I've written more than 50 but less than 100 grants in my life, and I've probably won less than 10. Okay, so what are your odds there? Not very good. But when you win them, you can do whatever you want with that money, right? Anything you want. No one is telling you what you've got to do with it. And that's sort of the nice upside with it. So I can tell you, so your professors here at UNC, or even as I'm a professor now at UNC Greensboro, they probably write 2, 3, 4 grants a year, I would bet, to try to keep themselves funded. Maybe more. I can tell you that I wrote more than 20 grants in 1 year when I was at RTI. That's a lot. I mean, I can tell you that's a lot. Now, they're not all new grants. A lot of them were partnerships. A lot of them were resubmissions and resubmissions and resubmissions of resubmissions. But I spent a lot of time writing. And if I think back on what I enjoyed when I was in graduate school, I actually kind of liked writing. I spent a lot of time doing it, trying to perfect what I'm saying. Even though people often don't read your grant, it gives me pleasure to write things a certain way. So then I moved from RTI to academics. Let me tell you a couple other things that are different about CROs. The overhead is much higher, at even higher than, I think Harvard's got the highest overhead rate in the country, or potentially Scripps, but one of the two. The overhead at CROs is much, much higher. There's nothing to float it underneath. You've got to be funded. You could do anything you wanted at RTI with two conditions. It had to be ethical, which was important in the early days of RTI being founded because you could have gotten money in the 1950s to say, I'm going to prove that tobacco is good for you, right? So it's got to be ethical and it's got to be fundable. And then you could do anything you wanted. We had great support. We had administrative assistants who would help us with many things. We had people who would help us copy our grants or put them in electronically. Anything you needed for a contract, people might not realize this, Research Triangle Institute is the world's ethical supply of THC, cocaine, heroin. If you want to do research on any of those things, there's a big contract at RTI that supplies that. And thus there's a whole support network of people helping you get those things out the door ethically, legally, without the police showing up. And the strategy there is use a contract to pay for the day-to-day expenses and leverage that into other grants. So let me just back up a second. So why did I leave RTI? The reason I left RTI is very complicated. There was a great opportunity that presented itself at UNC Greensboro. Again, a contact that I made at a meeting that I probably, had no reason to really go to. It was in a place I didn't really want to drive to, but I met somebody there, and then that led to something else, and led to something else, and eventually I get a job offer there. But also things were changing. Things were trying to change at RTI to be much more of a applied science as opposed to basic science. So I could kind of see the writing on the wall that as long as I kept myself funded, I would always have a job. But at some point, I was going to be 50 years old, have a kid in college, and not have a job. And so I was ready to sort of morph to something else. Plus, I wanted to do more teaching. So why am I going to give you guys career advice? Because I know you're all dying for me to tell you something that you can take with you. But also because about the year before I left RTI, I spent about a year faking like I was interviewing. I went out and gave a bunch of talks, and in my mind was trying to interview. Because like a lot of you, I don't feel exactly 100% comfortable in social situations. It might look like I'm looking you all in the eye, but I'm really not. Things like that. And so I spent about a year doing that. I spent a year then interviewing, and then since I've been at UNCG, I've been on the search committee for four different interview processes. So I've seen a lot of things come and go. So you can take or leave this advice, though. If you're going to try to apply for a job, I do not care if you're the world's expert at something. I get so many emails from somebody telling me, let me tell you about how great I am, blah, 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 and such thing. I can evaluate that. All right? I can look at your CV in 2 minutes or less and decide if you're the world's expert or if you worked for the world's expert. I don't need a long list of you telling me why you're the world's expert. I don't care if you work for some eminent scientist. If I don't know them, they're not eminent to me. I don't need you to list every instrument you've worked on. And this is even more important as you become a postdoc. If you're an undergraduate student looking for a job, you should probably say you've worked with an NMR or a mass spec or an HPLC. If you're a postdoc, if you're applying for a postdoc, you might want to mention a few things you worked on. But if I read your papers, I can figure out what you worked on. If you're a postdoc, don't tell me everything you've ever used in your life. I presume you know that. Your publications will speak volumes to you. I don't know if that's true if you're going for a career outside of academics or outside more of the traditional research levels. But I can tell you that your publications speak volumes. So if you're ever saying to yourself, I don't know if I need to write that paper, write the paper, okay? It's very important. Now, with your publications, especially those of you who are applying for academic jobs, you don't need to tell me your H index factor, how many times it's been cited, what the impact factor of the journal is, all that kind of stuff. None of that's important, okay? Don't tell me any of that stuff. I'll figure that out by looking at the papers. Don't put down publications in preparation. I see this routinely. I count it as a strike against you, all right? Especially if you've got like 2 papers on your resume and then like 7 written as in preparation. Don't put that on there. If you're going to list submitted publications, they better have been submitted like in the last month or 2, right? With like a date of where they've been submitted, what journal they've been submitted to, and the date they were submitted. Because you could have submitted them to Science, great, and they probably rejected it, all right? And that's, people are going to presume the worst, That's how scientists are. I think the quality of the publications is more important than quantity. When we look for new professors at UNCG, we've interviewed people who've only had 3 or 4 or 5 publications, particularly if they're in really high-impact journals. We've also interviewed and hired people who have got 20 or 30 publications. So there's not an exact correlation there. Know how to discuss your contributions to the paper. This is particularly true if you're an undergrad who's got your name on a paper, or if you're just coming out of graduate school and have your name on a lot of papers, especially second or third author. If somebody asks you, what did you do with that? Don't say, oh, not a whole lot. Yeah. You'd be surprised. Sometimes people say things like that, your knee-jerk response. Think about, I contributed to figure 3, figure 4, I worked on the materials and methods. I'm that first paragraph, that's me. And be honest. Don't lie about your papers. I think that's inherently obvious, but you'd be surprised what some people do. References. Include them on your CV or cover letter. I don't think you should ever say references available upon request. If they think you're good, leave them on there and give their direct contact information, including their phone number. Make sure you tell these people you're interviewing so that I can call them even without your permission. And don't drop any names unless you're prepared for them to be called. I can just tell you a story in the last year where somebody was name-dropping a couple people and had claimed that he had worked with somebody that I know. And I don't want to reveal too much about this, but I happen to know one of the people that he name-dropped. And he came out of that interview, man, he was our guy based on the interview. And I called up my friend who I worked with, but also is the kind of guy that I could just sit around and have dinner with. And just sort of casually asked him, I said, hey, do you happen to know this guy? Didn't tell him he was interviewing or anything. 4 minutes later, my friend gets done telling me all the terrible things this guy did. And I said, wow, that's really interesting. He goes, oh my God, is he interviewing with a job with you guys? I said, maybe, maybe not. Not anymore anyway. So, but this, and I think back on this guy, he name dropped about 8 or 9 people in his interview. And he should have been smarter than that. I only need a couple references. I don't need 20. Some people want to do that, especially if you've been around a long time. And it is nice. I saw recently someone showing their connections to these people they put on their resume. I worked with this person in undergrad. He was my graduate advisor, particularly if they weren't your graduate advisor. He was on my committee, and we interacted a lot for some reason. It's good to show connections. Always include a cover letter. Always make it unique. Just because you can send off a PDF to 1,000 people today with email doesn't mean it's going to get you a job. All right? I delete those weekly, and I'm not a hotshot. I get emails 3 times a week from people looking for a job. I can tell they've sent it to 100 people, and I routinely delete them, all right, as quick as I get them. All right? What I do read, though, is a letter that says something like, we haven't met, but I know you from the literature. You might know my graduate advisor. Make some connection, all right? Try to make some connection. That's where networking sort of comes into play. Don't presume that I want to talk to you via your favorite social media, okay? I can tell you, we recently accepted somebody to our graduate program who handed me his CV on very fancy paper in an envelope that was licked and closed, right, okay? That guy thoroughly impressed me because he was, it wasn't just the fact that it was on paper because I'm a grumpy old guy, but it's because he really took the time to prepare himself. When he handed it to me, I was at a meeting, and he even typed, like in the return address area, the numbers of his poster, asking me to come by and look at his poster, all right? This was a guy not shy, hanging behind his poster, but willing to have me come look at it. The older the person is, I'm probably getting in trouble for saying this, but the older the person is, the less they're going to want to talk to you via email or LinkedIn or something like that. All those things are valuable, but realize that sometimes people want to meet you face-to-face or talk with you on the phone. Try to make a solid connection. Okay, interviews. Dress appropriately, okay? It's okay to overdress. I can tell you, I went into chemistry loving the fact that I could wear a T-shirt and jeans, right? But it doesn't mean you should show up for an interview like that. Don't dominate the conversation. Sometimes people, as a nervous habit, will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Try to be engaging. But also don't be mute, all right? Don't just sit there silently, right? Because when you're interviewing, people are looking for a colleague as much as they're looking for the world's expert. There's world's experts in a lot of things. No matter, even if you do the most niche thing, I bet you I can find 3 or 4 people who'd apply for the job that were qualified, right? What you're looking for when you get hired, maybe particularly like your second or third job, is someone who can really work with for the next 10 or 15 years. Be engaging, always have questions to ask. All right, always, always, always. If you cannot think of a question to ask somebody about where they live in the area, how long have they been at the university, what is the school system like. You don't have to be about science. It could show that you're connecting, trying to connect to the place. We always take people out to dinner. I will tell you, don't drink too much during dinner, okay? Now there's a corollary. If you're Australian, it doesn't matter. Those guys can drink a lot. But I can also say don't drink too little. Now, my wife, if she was here, she would say, Nick, don't say these things to the students, you know. Because I have this drink a beer rule that I don't like to collaborate with anybody that I can't drink a beer with. But what I mean by that is not the fact that they can actually physically hold themselves drinking beer. What I mean is that they can sit around and have an engaging conversation about something besides the latest issue of the Journal of the American Chemical Society, right? And so even if you don't drink, we recently interviewed somebody who couldn't drink, all right? Beer, right? She had some allergy. Well, she drank wine. And she didn't drink a lot of it. I could tell she didn't love it. But she ordered a wine, and she sat there and engaged people in conversation. Turn off your cell phones for the entire interview. That includes text messaging. Just put it away. I've seen people pull it out and do something. Yeah, you can do it really quick, but it looks annoying when it looks like you're not engaged in the interview. Realize that we can find you on the web, even on your Facebook page. So if you put a whole list of all the places you're interviewing, we know what they are from your Facebook page. Especially if you put little comments like, oh God, one more to go, really nervous about this one. Yeah, okay. Look people in the eye, okay, and have a firm handshake. I think this is particularly important if you're not an American, all right? So for those of you who are not American, it's important to have a firm handshake. In fact, I'm always impressed when women have a really firm handshake. Maybe that's a Midwestern thing I learned. If you don't like looking people in the eye, you can always look at their nose. And it makes them think you're looking at them in the eye, okay? So, final thoughts. Be yourself, okay? Don't try to oversell yourself or undersell yourself. You got to be yourself. I think, as our previous speaker was saying, like, you know, you kind of need to know what it is that you're good at and what you like to do, and it'll eventually sort of evolve. How smart you are is not the most important quality. Your ability to work with people probably is. The idea of a scientist working in a lab all by himself and getting the Nobel Prize someday just does not happen. Everything is done in a team. Everything is done in a team. And the farther you get away from academics, the more the team is important. Don't panic. I know a lot of you are thinking like, oh God, the economy is awful. It is. I mean, I can feel your pain. I can tell you the economy was awful in 1992 when I graduated from college. I had a friend who had all of her rejection letters. She was an accounting major. All of her rejection letters from 30 different companies taped up on the wall around her apartment, right? So, I mean, the economy comes and goes, all right? And it's bad, you know. Find something to do. Even if you can't find the greatest job, find something to do. And realize that your career is really a journey. It's not a destination. It's highly likely that whatever this first job you're going to get is, you're not going to be doing it forever. You're going to be moving on to something else somewhere along the line. I can say that even, you know, I was at RTI, and I think some people to this day still say, you mean you left the place that discovered Taxol, right? I mean, I'm a natural products guy through and through. This is the place that discovered Taxol. How could I possibly leave? Well, things change, right? Things change all the time. So I leave it at that. Good luck.